Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fashion Law Institute's very first online webinar, Going Viral. I'm so sorry that it took such a terrible crisis to make this happen, but the silver lining, and we're all looking for silver linings these days, is that it can bring us all together as a community. So let's take a moment to acknowledge that lots of people are suffering right now. Via illness, via the loss of loved ones, and of course, via the economic constraints we're all finding ourselves under at the moment. That being said, I believe there's hope. And I believe that coming together is what we can do best. And in that vein, we have a beautiful panel of experts who have come together to join us this morning. And to help us start addressing these issues. Those of you who have looked at the list of speakers, I can tell you that Nancy Bishai will not be joining us from Montreal this morning. She is the general counsel for App Group, which owns the brands Macaj and Soya & Kyo, and they are having an emergency corporate meeting this morning. However, we have a really brilliant lineup of panelists, starting with Tony Kim, who is the CEO of Hero Within, and I will come back and introduce them all in just a moment. Gary, but wait, panelists, and of course your names are on the screen as well, for those of you who wish to hover over your screen. Gary Wassner, CEO of Hilden. Diana Bernal, who is a retail consultant and has worked for many different brands in the past, including most recently Richemont, Van Cleef & Arpels, the parent of Van Cleef & Arpels, among others. We have Don Obert joining us from Italy, from Firenze. Nice to see you, Don. He was an attorney and also teaches our course in international trade and fashion law. Karen Jefferson, who is employment counsel, actually, and I will get this correct for you, Karen. A deputy general counsel for labor and employment at Benjamin Moore, some very fashionable paint, but also a former model, and also a professor for us of fashion law drafting. We have Christina Del Valle, who is Senior Associate Counsel at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yes, that Metropolitan Museum, the Met Gala. And Jeff Trexler, who is also a practicing attorney and the Associate Director of the Institute. I also want to thank quickly Ariel Alaya, our Assistant Director, and Gloria Kim, our Dean's Fellow this year, who have done amazing work putting all of this together. And so thank you all. Some quick rules of the game. Our panelists will speak. If you would like to send Q&A, you can see your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Ariel will be sending me your questions, or as many of them as we can accommodate, for after the panelists have spoken. And I would remind the panelists to, while others are speaking, to use mute buttons to reduce noise. And oh, by the way, we had really wanted to actually see all of you. I know that you can see us, we can see, and you can see all the panelists, but we can't see you. So per the email, there's an after party and we can actually see one another together. So without further ado, Tony, as CEO of Hero Within, very appropriately named for these difficult times, you are managing a small business, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with Hero Within, is originally began as menswear and now has expanded, thank you very much, to women's wear, based on licensed characters from the comics world. Our licensing of some of those logos and so forth in a very sophisticated and an elegant way. Ladies, I'm really partial to the Wonder Woman denim jacket with is so subtle, but it had the stitching and the yoke across the back is in the shape of the Wonder Woman logo. Yeah. All right. But Tony is also actually actively engaged, one of the first members of the fashion community, actively engaged in trying to provide personal protective equipment to first responders and healthcare professionals. And so he'll tell you about that effort as well. Yeah. And so over to you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Susan. And yeah, it's been, as we all know, such an unprecedented time. As a small business, we're just finished up our third year, so we're still in that kind of startup sort of phase. And yeah, the crisis has really, it has suddenly just shocked all of us. For us, we depend so much of our, well, let's put it this way, it's affected us in two different ways. Um, the crisis for us, like many, began back in February because of our production pipeline was it's in China for a significant amount of our production. And so after when Chinese New Year uh, finished and production was supposed to begin back in early February, well, the factories didn't reopen, as we all know. Many of the factories did, most of the factories didn't reopen, and which had a pretty big impact on us because of our spring collection was coming in, and we were really ramping up and gearing up for 2020, and so but the whole month our factories were shut down, which really just put through everything in a tailspin. Then as we went into March, for our company, a majority, well, I'll probably say about 60% of our business really comes from our trade show, our convention appearances, and March in particular, March and April was a significant amount of it's probably our second busiest month of the year is in March, and so to go into this month to actually end up basically canceling, we had 4 of our major shows in a row that were all canceled. That just created like again just such an unprecedented set of events. Everyone has events that an event will close or something will happen, but to have basically at this point the next 3 months has pretty much cleared is mind-boggling to say the least. And so for us, I think it's been we've had to pivot significantly, and I think the first thing we did was we sent a letter to our customer base and our fan base that basically a letter that I wrote that we've all seen letters from various leaders of industry that have basically just identified, hey, this is a pretty significant crisis, and we don't know how we're going to navigate it, but we're going to do it together. And so for one of the things that we did was we felt like, well, quite honestly, we just kind of looked into, tried to be as sober about this and just say that, we, like many other different companies, we can't make it a month, 2 months without our sort of dependent income. And so if we have 6 months or 6 weeks, maybe 2 months left of this, then let's use our resources to try to contribute the best way we can, any way possible. So we started focusing almost right away on what can we do to provide some sort of support or relief to affected areas. And so one thing that we did was we asked our factories to sort of shift gears and focus on the production of face masks. Because our Chinese factories by March started reopening slowly. So we started asking them to focus on the production of face masks, and we started reaching out to some different areas and we got inundated by requests about just a shortage of face masks, as we've seen on the media, how much different hospitals and medical facilities are in need. So we started raising some money to be able to provide and to purchase face masks to be able to ship to different areas. And so in the past week or so, we've been able to raise, and we're in the process now of ordering and sending to just 4 different regions that we've been sending masks to. And so when 2020 opened, we thought that this was we expected it to be our sort of biggest and brightest year in the geek fashion industry, and now we're making face masks. So it just has been such a talk about a plot twist. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what's happened in the past couple of months.
Tony, kudos to you for pivoting and doing something positive for others at this really difficult time. And I hope you'll send us the information on how people can contribute,
yeah.
Of course. And your website is?
herewithinstore.com. Here Within is the name of the company, so if you just Google that, then it'll pop up.
Great. And for those who don't know, your entire business model really puts you at the juxtaposition of event cancellation and the bottom falling out of the fashion industry
Yeah,
because
because
you're
of yeah
at the
yeah.
convention.
Besides the fact that the convention is dropping out, as we know, most people aren't spending online. Their focus online is on toilet paper and hand sanitizers and essentials, and so they're not necessarily focused on online spending on on fashion so much, especially since there's not events for people to go to wear things to, and so. So really, this has affected us on all sides, as production, our online experience, as well as in-show events. And so, so we're just we're still sort of dazed and shocked and reaching out to many of my peers as far as just trying to figure out what we can do. And we're attending panels like this, and we're just trying to pivot as much as we can. We're pivoting so much. We're doing 360s right now, and but you know what? We're all in this together, and I'm convinced that this isn't the end for us all. And it just means that it's just a new reality, and we just have to embrace that and move forward with as much and project as much hope and optimism as possible.
And one thing that I will ask you and all of our panelists to think about is when you can return to, when Comic-Cons and comic conventions do reopen, how will you change your practices? Will there be try-on issues? Will you be constantly spraying everything down with Lysol? You know, how are we going to manage a new sensitivity to contagion, which is going to be very important in the fashion industry, even more so for things like cosmetics, of course. So that'll be one thing for us to think about, how to manage. So thank you so much, Tony. And thanks for being up at the crack of dawn out there in California.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, my schedule has suddenly opened up. So I'm glad to.
Yeah. Marvelous. Thank you. And now Gary, Gary Wasner, for those of you who don't know, as I said, is the CEO of Hilden. Which is the preeminent fashion factoring firm in the United States and does business with many other places as well. And also a tremendous thought leader in the fashion industry who's been doing a great deal to try to bring us together in good times and bad, I should say. And I could go on for a great deal of time introducing Gary, but I think it's Gary's voice that we need to hear right now. And please unmute yourself, Gary.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thanks, Susan. I mean, it's clearly incredible, difficult times. We all realize that. But one thing that is unique about these times is that there is an end to this. It's going to end. It's going, this too shall pass. And it's not going to be 6 months from now. It's going to be sooner than that. There will be consequences. There are consequences, but they're going to be short term. So we have to keep that in mind all the time. We finance and factor over 450 brands here. So you can imagine how this is affecting manufacturers and designers. It also brings us to the realization how dependent the sourcing supply chain is on each link in it. As soon as this happened, the stores stopped accepting deliveries of merchandise. That rolled to the manufacturers. That rolled down to the, that rolled down to the brands. That rolled down to the manufacturers. That rolled down to the fabric suppliers and to the financiers and everybody in the entire chain that creates a product that ends up in a retail store or on a website. So we have been trying to negotiate better terms with both sides, with each link in the chain, and trying to make it fair and equitable for them all. Retailers have, unfortunately, canceled orders, knee-jerk reaction during the panic phase of this, which I think is starting to level off on the business side. But initially, they just went out, canceled orders. April, May, June they said these deliveries are gone, their purchase orders, their contracts, they're null and void. We're not accepting deliveries, we're canceling all orders. In addition, they went and they changed the terms, and they're doing that every day now on already shipped product. So instead of net 30-day terms, we're now hearing from major retailers like a TJX and like a Ross stores that they're tacking on 90 days to the already existing terms, which means they're not paying invoices that were shipped for 6 months in some cases. What does that do to the cash flow of small business? I don't think they really thought about that. Now, for some of the larger apparel manufacturers, the ones that service the Ross stores and the Walmarts and the Costcos, it's a problem, but it's not a critical problem. For small brands that depend upon this cash flow to pay their payroll, to purchase their merchandise, to pay their factories, and just to survive, it is critical. So what we've suggested, and we're suggesting to everyone, first of all, communication is essential in times like these. Make sure you talk to everybody you do business with. Share the problems you're having. It's not unique to you. This is a global issue. Share them. Work together to try to figure out how to solve some of them. When the initial orders were being canceled by stores like Nordstrom, we went into the market. I went into the market and I said, guys, don't just accept that. Go back and negotiate. Provide alternatives to a straight cancellation of an order. Don't accept it. Say, no, I can't. You need to work with me. We need to figure something out. Push deliveries ahead. Offer a discount. Cancel what you can. Reassort your product so it's more appropriate for when you're actually going to be shipping it. Now, knowing we're not going to be shipping, certainly in the month of April. And this information, though it's not earth-shattering suggestions, makes a huge difference in the negotiation of how we all move forward. When the panic is over, which I really believe it's starting to ebb somewhat, and we're starting to think forward thinking about what's next, how do we prepare for what's next? We have to be positive about it. We have to realize that the sequence, the cadence of apparel has changed. We're going to be shipping spring, summer in June and July. We've not done that before, but reality tells me that the consumer in today's world, the buy now, wear now consumer, has been thinking that way for years, and retailers just have not caught up. So they've been stuck in this promotional cycle where they get the merchandise in way too early and then it's on sale by the time you actually need to wear it. So here we are with an opportunity to change the cadence of our industry. Ship when people actually want the product. Don't mark it down as soon as you've done in the past. Let it go through the season at full price when people actually want it. When the next season starts to come in, then mark down what is no longer appropriate for the time frame we are at that moment in. So if retailers understand that there's an opportunity to change this cadence, and we can push every season forward by 2 months, we'll save thousands of brands from sitting on inventory that they can no longer sell unless they sell it at below cost, or flood the market with off-price products. So this is a negotiation and a discussion. I'm speaking to all the major retailers, to the CEOs, to try to get a sense of what they're thinking. Many of them now are coming around to this changing of the cadence of retail deliveries and pricing. It's problematic if one major does not agree, because then they'll go into the market with the same merchandise that everybody else is trying to sell at full price. They'll discount it to create immediate cash flow for themselves at the expense of everybody else. So this really has to be an industry effort. All of these things have to be industry-wide. We need to talk, we need to communicate, we need to talk to those we buy from, tell them there's going to be a change in the way we pay. If we don't have cash flow coming in, we can't pay for our merchandise. We know people are cutting back on orders, it's affecting the factories. Factories are dependent obviously on labor. Labor is a weekly paycheck. When they can't meet their payroll, it's a real problem. They shut down. They don't have reserves of cash. And most of our clients, as I said, about 450 fashion brands, most of whom you will know if you shop at all anywhere, they do not have cash flow coming in unless they have an e-com business. And even then, all that's selling e-com is comfort clothing for people who are sequestered at home. I've suggested to many brands, curate a group for your e-com customers who are at home. Make them feel good about it. That if they're going to buy anything in these troubled times, it's got to make them feel good, and it's got to have a use. People aren't frivolous in these kinds of times. They're nervous and worried. Make them happier than they are. Give them something that they can sit back in and feel comfortable about and purchase, even if it's a small item. You have that product in your collection. Everybody has that easy product in their collection, that feel-good product in the collection. It's not a time, and I hate to say it because I live in New York, but it's not a time for black clothing that is depressing and constricting. It's a time for comfort clothing, just as we all are sitting home getting fat on comfort food. So there are many things you can do to weather this storm, and I think the most important thing, and I'll conclude at that point, the most important thing is to realize that this will end. We have to plan ahead. Yes, our issues now are critical. The government in this new stimulus package has provided quite a bit for small business, including payroll relief that is in the form of a loan initially, but will be forgiven if you comply with the terms of the loan. You could save your business 4 months, I believe it's 4 months, of payroll expense. You don't lay off people, you don't furlough people, you don't reduce salaries of those being paid more than $100,000, and you qualify in that case for the loan being converted into a forgiven grant. That's significant. There's also 500 companies with 500 or fewer employees. There's quite a bit of support available from both the SBA and this federal grant system that's being put into place. You need to talk to your accountants. It's unfortunately not an easy process. It's not something you can sit home and do by yourself, because for the SBA particularly, if your applications are incomplete, they get tossed. Try to do it again, it becomes more difficult. Make sure all your information is complete. You've provided an answer to every question. If you can't do that, reach out to your accountants or to your business advisors who can help you. It's tedious, it's difficult, but it can save your business. There's a lot of opportunity here for small business if you take advantage of it. The best thing I can say, again to conclude, is talk to everybody in your supply chain, up and down. Negotiate, make sure everybody's aware that they're on the same page here, that we have to work together as an industry to survive in every aspect. And that if you give a little here, they'll give a little there. Nobody can act unilaterally here and come out of this safe and sound. Our supply chain just does not work that way. So with those words, keep your chins up. There is an end to this. And so many of us here are here to support you through this.
Gary, you are so right. Thank you for those important words and suggestions. I want to underscore the suggestion to get your paperwork in order, right? This is a time to not only Marie Kondo your home because you're stuck at home, but also to really in preparation for any kind of loan forgiveness program. And we have some of those highlighted in the written materials for certain localities. And we can certainly crowdsource additional things from you all as this goes forward, but it's really a time to get your business finances in order. Also, I love that you emphasize the need to work together in community. In fact, you gave a classic example of the prisoner's dilemma, right? See also Batman movie and Prison Ship, right? The idea that if we all work together, we will come through this well, and if we do not, we will all fail. And so I think that's so important. The other thing I'd like to really underscore that you mentioned was the need for negotiation and cooperation. Those of you who are lawyers or legal professionals or who work with lawyers and legal professionals listening, this is the time for the bulldogs to stay in their kennels. This is a time for soft legal skills. I was looking at an order from the Northern District of Illinois that came down this past week. It was in an anti-counterfeiting case. It had to do with phone cases and small leather goods that had unicorns and hearts and elves on them. And the judge was absolutely livid that the attorney was requesting action immediately now and a hearing. The judge was openly derisive with regard to the actual merch, which was a little unfortunate. We're going to see a little more anti-fashion, I think, from time to time, but he actually concluded the world is facing a real emergency. Plaintiff is not. The motion to reconsider the scheduling order is denied. So negotiation and patience, I think, as Gary said, are going to be your friends here.
Susan, I'd like to bring one more thing, raise one more point. And I know we're all going to be talking about this later, but I was reading a purchase order from one of the major retailers who had just canceled, it's over a $5 million order, and they had just canceled the order, just canceled it. And my comments had been, a purchase order is a contract. You can't just cancel it. It has terms, and it's signed, and it's official, and it's legal. But there was an act of God clause in the purchase order, and in it, it stated specifically one of the events that would trigger that would be disease. So, as I'm not a lawyer, do people really need to read their purchase orders that closely? There's so much fine print. And negotiate those terms, force majeure and acts of God, before they accept them? I don't think most people are aware they're even in there.
Gary, that is a great point. And I think to answer it, I may jump over Diana and go back and go to Jeff and then come back to Diana, if that's all right. But yes, the force majeure clauses have been around forever. They're part of the boilerplate that no one reads. They've literally, the fact that we use a French term, it means that they go back to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. I mean, this is going back a long way, this kind of clause. And those that include disease or contagion are the best, of course, right now, because many jurisdictions, including New York, interpret force majeure clauses, the idea that there is an act of God, there is literally a force more powerful than the contract agreement and then the parties in the agreement. It prevents any kind of performance of the agreement, are very long-standing. But again, interpreted narrowly, and something that we will all be reading more carefully going forward and putting in contracts going forward. But yes, it is important, I think, to, as a baseline for negotiation, read your existing contracts, because everything is so specific to the wording of your particular contract. That being said, fashion is very relational, right? And if every entity that has a force majeure clause written in its favor actually cancels, everyone loses in the end. So there will be litigation based on the specific wording of specific clauses. As part of pulling together that financial paperwork, you certainly want to pull together all of the wording from your purchase orders and so forth. But it's not going to be the only thing to think about. And Jeff, I know that this is something you've been looking very closely at. So let me go to you on that question as well.
No, force majeure, it's a very interesting situation that we're in, because I think most people are used to conducting business in a certain way. And those boilerplate clauses are often drafted for, the worst case scenario. And usually think of the scenarios like infringement and that sort of thing, or complete breakdown in communication. But if you've been working with somebody for a number of months or years, you're not thinking that the relationship is necessarily going to snap the way it's been breaking down now. But then the worst case happens. Then we have the zombie apocalypse, and all of a sudden, everyone is looking to these boilerplate clauses. And the unfortunate reality with these boilerplate clauses is that they're often written to protect the company or individual that is, submitting this clause in is the one who prepared the clause in the contract. So you could find yourself in a position where, as a designer, say, where a force majeure clause is drafted like the one that Gary just mentioned, allowing the retailer to cancel everything in the case of a disease. But then the designer could be in a contract with the supplier that does not mention disease as a way to get out of a contract. And there are courts, particularly business-friendly courts in New York, Delaware, other jurisdictions around the world, where predictability is the primary value in terms of a contract, where they interpret these provisions very, very, very narrowly. And so you may find yourself in a position where legally, the retailer can cancel your order, the order of your goods, but you can't cancel anything that you've ordered to prepare those goods. So yes, you definitely need to read those clauses. One of the things I try to do for my clients is to read the clauses they don't read and point out those traps. But I believe everybody should be reading their clauses and know what they're signing, because you do not know when it's going to come back to bite you. But that said, I want to underscore, what the ability to pivot, like Tony mentioned, and the ability to renegotiate your contracts. We're in a position right now where adhering to the strict language of each contract could be fatal to the industry, because there is an infrastructure here that we're in danger of losing. Small designers, small producers, everybody along the lines of the supply chain, and these can have ripple effects, not just throughout the economy of the United States, but say, thinking about the broader supply chain, there's been some talk in the industry, as you know, about Bangladesh. And there has been, over $1.5 billion of orders canceled so far. There's more coming down the line. Bangladesh government, if you've been reading about what they've been trying to do to keep things stable, that is that country is in a very politically sensitive position. So we could be facing a situation where a massive supply chain disruptions down the line if retailers do not make an effort to get some money to brands and designers who can then keep the supply chain down the line in money itself, in funded itself, so they can avoid having to fire their employees and have all the system-wide problems there. And this is something down the line. And I want to reiterate something other people have said so far. Pay attention to the language, not just to your contracts, but to aid. The government provisions are highly technical. I've been talking with some people about this recently. There are limits on the amount that you can claim, and in terms of forgiveness, and Gary mentioned the $100,000 limit on payroll. You want to be careful in terms of what you use the money for. There are very specific statements in the Act about what you can use it for in terms of utilities and rent and payroll and what's included in those payroll costs. And again, I know we have people viewing this from around the world, and there are different statutes, different decrees being issued all around the world with provisions for unemployment and making adjustments to social support network, to money, loans, or grants to businesses. And so you want to be able to interact with your counsel and accountants to make sure that you're doing what needs to be done in terms of documentation and application around the world. Then there are also these intangibles. One of the things that this crisis has called attention to is that we've lost our ability in many ways as a culture to deal openly with risk. We're used to an environment where things are relatively safe. So so when we find something that could be harming a lot of people, killing a certain number of people, it's creating this shock to the system where we feel like we need to cancel everything in order to bring it to an end. And their previous generation simply did not do that. They build in a certain amount of risk. Now people are going to be fly-specking. They're going to be inspecting all sorts of interactions to see those risk inflection points. So if you go into a store and you try on something, we need to be prepared for the possibility that consumers are going to be seeing clothing stores where they try on things as a vector for disease and start attributing their own illness to the fact that they went to the local store and tried on some pants. And you may find some lawsuits coming down the pike in a few months or years where people are claiming that they got sick because they went to some store. And this could be very hard. It may be hard for them to prevail, but it's also going to be hard for you to defend. And so coming up with ways to deal with this and present an atmosphere, an environment of safety, that you are doing as much as you can in order to keep things clean and in order to prevent the spread of disease, may be part of the design environment now for brands in a way far beyond what it was before. And brands are in an interesting position because you cannot. It's not like like a package of rat poison where you put stuff on the side, do not use this rat poison on your cornflakes, do not, if you smoke this, you could get cancer. We can't have signs all around stores talking about the horrible things that could happen if you try on clothes. So it's going to require a certain amount of creative interaction between counsel, communications, and the brands themselves in terms of how to create that environment to minimize the risk of a lawsuit or losing in a lawsuit if one should happen. The same thing with workplace safety. I think there are provisions in OSHA. One of my theories that why we had so many stores closing before the government stepped in to shut them down was that there are provisions in our occupational safety and health laws in the United States about maintaining a safe workplace. So if, particularly where people are touching clothes that have been worn by others, there would be, I'm not saying that OSHA has, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has done this yet, but there is legal language that could give OSHA the right to say, hey, you're not providing a safe workplace because your staff, your salespeople are getting sick after touching clothes or interacting with people. So we're going to have to think about how to deal with that.
On that, I think.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that we need, and I look forward to hearing what Karen has to say, because this is going to be a very difficult issue. So a lot of flexibility is going to be important, and rethinking everything, to how we talk about risk, to how we integrate risk into our design environments, to how we are a little bit more scrupulous in terms of our reading of contracts, and also being very careful about what we need to do with respect to government in terms of getting grants and keeping grants, or getting loans and keeping loans. This is the brave new world we're a part of. I know we had a question. There were two questions that popped up that I want to close on. One was, do fashion retailers have a corporate responsibility to support government efforts in this crisis? I think one theme that has come out so far is that I see supporting government efforts as one part of it, but I think really supporting the industry as a whole is another part of it. This is a place where people who have disposable income can come in and buy things to help retailers and brands and designers. But I also think retailers have a certain amount of responsibility to the world and to their own self-interest to keep everything below them alive. Also, there was an interesting question about antitrust. What can brands do in this situation? Even though the world has changed and the conditions of law has changed, as Gary said, things will settle down. And when things settle down, they will be looking back to those old legal principles. So this is not the time, while the industry should be joining together, this is not the time the industry should be joining together to do things like set prices. If the government's going to be doing some regulation, they're great, but there are ways you can set market stability in terms of setting prices, or agreeing on what you're going to pay workers or when you're going to pay workers. Those sort of agreements can lead to trouble. And even though I guarantee you that right now it's not in the forefront of people's minds, one of the side effects of what's happening is that there's going to be, because there are going to be people in the middle and lower end who are smaller size who are dropping out, it's going to contribute to the concentration of the industry. And when you have a rising concentration in the economy, when everything settles down, then the pressure to enforce antitrust laws will increase. So you want to be careful about that right now.
I want to ask you a question myself on that last issue, because I've really been encouraging the major retailers to rethink the markdown cadence. And as I said when I was speaking previously, if one retailer who's selling the same brands as 10 other major retailers decides to open the season with a 40% markdown to quickly gather some cash, that would immediately force all the other retailers to mark everything down, since it's all on the web and it's all competitive and we all see the same product. And it would be a spiral into more damage. So I understand the legality of price fix, the illegality of price fixing and so on, but is there a workaround during these difficult times that we could suggest to the industry? I think, it's wartime. So certainly there are provisions that should apply during a situation like this.
Yeah, and there's provision for the.
And just to put that in context, you're referring also to what we saw in 2008 and the domino discounting that occurred, first when Saks marked down very deeply and then others. Of course, I would like Jeff to go ahead and continue addressing this question, but to remember that in speaking to you, it's different than the retailers getting in a room and speaking to one another, right? And talking generalized strategy is different from speaking about specific dates and percentages. So with that, back over to.
Yeah, and I think that's something that just what you were doing right now in terms of talking about the risk, I think that's going to be key in this current environment. A trade association coming out and saying you cannot have a discount is a different thing from people at gatherings such as this, or in conferences, or in various news outlets. I know we have some members of the media here writing op-eds, talking about the risks in this situation. I think the more you have it as part of an ongoing conversation and less as a set of backroom agreements, the greater the likelihood you'll survive any government scrutiny. And there are provisions in terms of this being wartime, and there are provisions in terms of the government allowing production of certain items without outside the scope of antitrust law. So there are ways that the government can help us in that environment. But I think the sort of thing that we're talking about here, just in terms of regular normal action in the marketplace, I think there will be some sensitivity. One of the things that happens, and it's a really unfortunate thing, we saw it in 9/11, there's a period of time where everybody comes together in a positive way to do good, and then things get back to normal, and then they start blaming each other and trying to, exactly, they try to take action against each other. So even in the midst of wartime, you want to remember that can happen. I mean, some of the most significant action in terms of antitrust in fashion took place in the midst of war with the Fashion Originators Guild. I mean, that took place in the context of the European War, so World War II. So it does settle, and so we need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah,
what's that? Oh yeah, it was definitely around. I was thinking like an American at that point in time, thinking about the newspapers and how they were describing it. So
there should be things that the government could do in a case like this. We know how France treats their retail industry, and when they allow sales and when they don't, and they do have a couple of weeks out of each season where product is permitted to go on sale. And other than that, it's not. So in a situation like this, I would think if we only had a lobbyist for our industry who could suggest some of these things, it would protect the brands, protect the retailers. It wouldn't harm the consumer, because ultimately the product's going to go on sale when the season ends. But I don't feel that without some kind of agreement, whether it's just a verbal discussion, I don't feel that every retailer will maintain price in an environment like this.
This gets at something that I found very disturbing about calling dividing between essential and non-essential industries, which there's this. One of the things that seems real to all of us in the fashion industry is that fashion is in many ways essential, not just in terms of the fact that it's the clothes that we wear every day. And so it's in a way more essential than a lot of things. But it's also economically vital. And by treating it as something we can shut down without consequence for a sustained period of time, we're missing the fact that there's a lot of economic havoc that we're wreaking throughout the world, really. And so to have a voice where we could go to Washington and say, this is a major economic force. It is not non-essential. You shut this down, you're going to shut down the economy. You're going to hurt a lot of people, whether or not they're directly involved with the fashion business. And creating some sort of legal basis to get the same kind of exemptions or concessions that you get, say, if you are producing masks right now, and the FDA providing some special leeway, and Congress providing some special leeway with respect to masks, or or providing, clothing for the Pentagon, to get people to see that this is something vital, and there needs to be some exceptions in special times in terms of when we can act together or when the government can step in and control this. I think that's going to be vital going forward. I think that's going to be a discussion that should not stop with this broadcast.
Okay, I think we're going to have a separate conversation at another time about collective action and the government, and I think that's a wonderful suggestion. Yeah. At this point, though, I think I want to pivot because we have 4 more panelists and go to Diana. Jeff, you raised and if those of you who couldn't tell, I forgot to tell you, Jeff teaches our fashion ethics, sustainability, and development course, and so has that broad perspective and advises a number of very key brands on these issues. You mentioned the design issue, which of course falls directly in Diana's wheelhouse. And so Diana, having spent your career in retail and retail development, negotiating some of these licenses and real estate leases, and also engaging in store design, I'd like your thoughts on how things are changing and what the issues are that are important for us to recognize.
I mean, both Gary, I mean, everyone so far, as I'm sure the rest of the panelists will also point out, is what's happening is unprecedented. There is such a need for communication. Biggest issue, I think, is liquidity, particularly in fashion retail. The cash flow issue has a domino effect all the way down to suppliers, employees. Rent is a huge expense for retailers. I do think that end of March was something everyone was as comfortable as you can be, because pretty much I think everyone had paid through end of March. So really now going into a new month or a few months more of this, it's going to be about reviewing those contracts. It's going to be taking the opportunity, since many of us do have a little bit more time on our hands, to look at the clauses, to as quickly as possible discuss things with landlords, with tenants, because I think one of the things that maybe when people talk about landlord-tenant relationship is actually those subleases. I know a lot of that there are a lot of direct-to-consumer clicks to bricks brands that to get into a physical space very quickly took on a sublease. So, the domino effect of even who you're dealing with and who is affected by not paying rent, multiplies even in that respect. I think that it's going to be about flexibility on the landlord side. Landlords don't want to evict or have to deal with empty storefronts more than what they already have. So I think that they're going to be flexible, but I think it's also going to be hard for them to be able to be flexible for how long of a period of time, not knowing exactly when this is all going to come to an end. So I do think that alternatives should be discussed, as Gary mentioned, different options, rent abatements, deferrals, suspensions. Walmart has the liquidity, is much larger company. I mean, they're actually providing free rent. I think it's through April for sure, but even maybe a little bit longer for the shops within their stores, the small businesses within their stores. So where that can happen, those companies should keep doing that. There are reputations that landlords want to uphold. There's a long-term relationship that that everyone wants to keep intact. So I think that that's going to be key, is to really be able to talk and renegotiate where possible, and really come up with as many ideas, even if they seem kind of obvious or maybe so far out there, but I think that's how people get to a happy medium and compromises. I do think that if this maybe isn't in clauses, business interruption insurance, which sometimes I don't think covers things like pandemics, but something to consider and to look into. I don't know if many people even know that that might be something out there that they can look into and potentially put into a lease. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be done. This is a time to be able to really look at maybe what hasn't been working even before this and how to make it better. On a personal note, I mean, I've been in the retail industry for many, many years. And one of the reasons that, besides the creativity and the passion and the change, is the fact that this industry and the people that I've worked with are so resilient. And you know, you need to be optimistic, you need to be realistic, but you also have to be a troubleshooter, and you have to be thinking about like how to, okay, we're not being dealt the best hand right now, but how do we make the most of it, and what can we do that can actually set us up for when this does finish, does pass, where we could actually be better partners with, like I said, our landlords, be better service providers to our clients, be better members of the community. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think it's just about definitely keeping that in mind, that you know, the positive aspect of this and the momentum that we can move forward with conversations like this, I think are really, it's going to take everyone to another level, another phase, a different way of looking at their business.
Diana, that's so helpful. And I want to follow up with two things. You've been an expert for us on retail and retail technology before. And we've had in the questions, and also in my mind, some questions about whether or not new retail technologies, can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Good. Whether new retail technologies will be brought to bear after. Are we going to see more smart mirrors? Are we going to see more AR and VR used in the retail context, in part to address the touch question? So that's one thing I'd like to ask you about with respect to specifics for what stores might look like after this crisis moving forward. And the other is, you know, I live in downtown New York. And I've walked around Soho, and I have seen the luxury brands, particularly those who are based in Europe, first empty their stores completely and then board them up. And I imagine part of this is the very recent memory of riots in Paris and windows broken and concerns about theft and looting. But is there a reason perhaps to continue, even if you invoke an act of God or a force majeure clause, or make some kind of argument for impossibility of performance? Is there any reason to, as you renegotiate with the landlord, to continue paying rent on an empty space, even some kind of reduced rent, or to come up with some kind of relational accommodation, much the way that Gary was recommending and Jeff was also discussing in the context of product?
Yeah, I mean, well, landlords do depend on not just rent. They do depend on the revenues of those tenants to help them with the mortgages that they have, the maintenance that they need to do on their shopping centers or properties, as you're mentioning, the stores in Soho. You know, I kind of feel the way that was being said, and I apologize if it was Jeff or Gary or maybe both of you, about the purchasing and the need to continue to help stimulate the economy in that way if you can. I mean, the rent, it helps, you know, so many other people to do what they need to do, that I think that it's part of it's part of the course with having a physical space is continuing to work in the way that you can with your landlords and paying some type of rent. I mean, whether it's upfront, if you can do it, great, you should. And also you should be paying your suppliers and the other people that you can immediately. But if you can't, working out some type of either completely renegotiated deal or maybe something where in a following year, payments are made in a different way, so that they can recoup that down the line. And then your question, does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And so then go on to the question about the tech. Absolutely. I think there's definitely going to be a lot more looking at the tech and how to implement it in physical spaces. I think mainly, especially immediately after all of this passes and the stores open again, that really big concern about touching things. So when it comes to payments, I think you're going to see a lot more use of like the financial technology versus cash. I think that there's going to be, more opportunities where things that you can do on a virtual AR manner, where maybe you don't physically have to touch things as often, it's going to come into play a lot. And it's an investment, but it is actually something that I think retail should be looking at now. I think that a lot of people maybe have put it to the side, one, because it's still not in a perfect stage, but also because it can be expensive. But I think that when you look at the long-term value of it, and the fact that right now you have an opportunity to have the time to figure out how to implement it in your spaces and within your systems, that you're going to see, you're definitely going to see a lot more of that.
So in addition to a change in product, things that are, as Gary said, are comfy or work from home, clavicle up chic, because that's all we can see of one another right now, or what stores might look like in the future, there will be some strong bright spots that we can look to. So thank you. On that note, I'd like to turn to Don, actually. So thank you. That was very helpful, Diana. Benvenuti, Don. Don is joining us from Italy.
Hi, how are you?
And Don Obert, the Obert Law Firm. Don also, as I mentioned, teaches our international trade, fashion law and international trade course, flies in to do that for us, but is based in Firenze and is an expert as an attorney in the area of international trade. So, oh my goodness, Don, you are in a hot spot.
That's the understatement of the century. Yes, we are in the hot spot. We're not in the hottest part of the hot spot. Most of what is happening in the north, in the Lombardy region. That's been hurt the worst out of anybody. Tuscany has not been too bad. It's really come down to just the quarantining and the lockdown. So everybody's just holding tight. There's still food available, but other than that, non-essential stores, according to what everybody else would think, not to this panel, everything else is basically closed. You need to have a sheet of paper basically with you, explaining, signed and sworn to, stating where you will be going and why you need to go.
Just a moment. One of the, I just received a question reminding me that I need to offer you CLE codes. Those of you who are attorneys who are in New York or who are in states that offer reciprocity will need to record a couple of words. The first, I want you to write down positive words today. Write down optimism as our first code word. All right. And on that note, our first code word for CLE is optimism. And with that, back to Don. So Don, from a legal perspective, right, how are we dealing with the international trade issues and how are you assisting your clients in these regards?
Well, it's been a tough time from the clients that I've spoken to in China, here in Italy, in the United States. Obviously, it's affecting everyone. I always say that, like the proverb says, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And in international trade, there are many links in the chain where anything can go wrong. And while people who are involved in trade usually put provisions in place and can provide for specific failures, they don't necessarily contemplate the entire system falling apart completely. So that is really what has become an issue, because it's a pandemic. It's across the world, and it hasn't been really hitting as one. It's been in waves. So where we saw China being hit in December and in January, production was basically stopped. And while they're coming out of it, now the rest of the world, where the customers are going into the abyss, so to say, while China is slowly coming out of it. My clients in China have said that the factories are starting to work, starting to come together. It's just a little difficult because some workers are sick. Some workers still can't get to where they need to go because transportation has been shut down, and that's been stopping everything. But as Gary had pointed out, what's really happening a lot is there's a lot of order cancellations, and the factories can't produce enough. The logistics aspect is really not the issue in the sense of moving freight. In fact, freight rates are down. I think Los Angeles cargo imports is down 50%. In Rotterdam, it's down 20%. So it's not about necessarily moving the goods. It's about the production of the goods. And if you do move them, where are they going to go? Who is going to take them? Who is going to venture outside and take them? And that's really what I've been dealing with my clients in trying to figure out ways to minimize the damage. And like I said, it's not an easy question because everything is so fluid at this time. Every day we're finding different things happening. And here in Italy, as I said, it started with the north, then it came down south. My children have been out of school for weeks. They're learning digitally. My daughter just got the happiest news of her life that the IB exams have been canceled. So it's just a crazy time. The aspects that I've been telling my clients what to deal with, that a lot to do with what Gary had said, is 3 words basically: coordination, flexibility, and preparedness. Coordination is what we've been discussing. It's relationships. In the fashion industry, you build up a lot of relationships. You work with these companies, these factories, the logistics providers for many, many years. Don't throw that down the tube. Everybody is in the same position. It is not that you're failing or having a hard time and everybody else is succeeding. Everybody is going through the same thing. Therefore, everybody needs to work with each other because we will come out of this. And when we do, people will remember the kindness. They will remember that you let things slide a little or that you help them get through the problem, and then they will give that back to you. Reputation is something that you cannot get back easily. And if you're going to renege on agreements and completely throw things down the tube, that's going to be an issue going forward. The word will get around. And even though fashion is global, it's a small industry in the sense that everybody sort of knows everybody. And so you have to do your part at this stage. I know in my business, not necessarily in the fashion relation, but I've been getting calls and helping out with respect to the movement of masks. Companies that are in China and their factories are open and they want to get masks to the US, and they need help getting a hold of customs and finding out how to get these masks in there as quickly as possible. So I'm up at night and we deal with that if that's what needs to be done. So as I said, speak with your suppliers, as Gary said, and everybody else has said, speak with your suppliers, speak with your transportation contacts, your logistics providers. They have seen stoppages in various areas before, and they will be able to help you work through these different aspects. Negotiation is the key. I believe, as you said before, don't come in with a hammer. Everybody's in the same position. It's not the time for the hammer. Right now, it's the time for the soft glove, and everybody needs to be as one. Let's see. Flexibility. Don't keep all your eggs in one basket. I think if anything that people have learned from this is that you need to be diversified, just like in stocks, just like in anything else. Putting all your eggs in one basket. Yes, while we're all going through the same thing at the same time, as I said before, this is moving in waves. And therefore, if you have suppliers in different places and you supply secure components from different places, you'll be able to shift your manufacturing around in a way that there will be a delay, but it won't be as much of a delay. And you'll be able to ride that wave through instead of having it crash down on top of you. Another thing to deal with not keeping your eggs in one basket is that when this does break, when everything clears and there's going to be an influx of merchandise, not only from the sense of flooding the market with tons of merchandise, but the fact is ports are going to be crowded. So you may want to think about using ports that are not normally used, not your main ports, because the major ports like Long Beach, Newark, those are going to be backed up for a long time because that's where everybody is going. So think in that sense and speak to your logistics providers because they'll know what's a good place to go, what's the least crowded, and also get you the best rates possible. One of the other aspects is promote your online sales. Right now, as you said, and as Jeff said, and as everybody said, nobody really wants to touch anybody. Nobody could really go outside. So you need to push your online sales, and there's actually a benefit to the online sales. I mean, if your goods are warehoused locally, that's fantastic. You'll have you'll have a pick and pack. Somebody can pick it, drop, and ship it out to your customers. But if your goods are stuck overseas, try to take advantage of that. There's a section in the customs regulations, section 321, and it deals with de minimis, and it will actually allow you to send merchandise to your customers duty-free up to $800 per day. Think about what you would have paid on the item if you would have imported it and then sold it. You would have paid the customs duties on the way in, and then you would sell it to your customers locally. So you would actually probably save some money by doing it in that manner. But what happens is it cuts out several people from the supply chain by picking and packing overseas, if that's where your factories are. Another concept is shifting your goods. If you have goods coming in, there are some markets who are going to open before others. If you have spring items and you're not going to be able to get rid of them at this point, you may want to contemplate moving them to somewhere where maybe the Southern Hemisphere, where when spring comes, you'll be able to sell these items. So moving your goods around the globe or to places where the market has opened up again. As I said, China, I believe they make up 30% of luxury sales, and they make up they only purchase 9% in China. They do it mostly as tourists, the Chinese, when they're traveling, and they're not traveling now. So it may be time to, as China is starting to open up, move goods or leave them in China or move them into China if that's not where they're being manufactured. The other issue is if your goods are being delayed or you can warehouse, when you bring them in, if you don't want to pay the duties, warehouse them, bonded warehouse. You don't pay the duties until you file a formal entry. So you could sort of hold out without having to release all that money to the government if your merchandise is already on the way in. If it's in and it's sitting here and you want to send it out, drawback. You send it out, you get back up to 99% of the duties. So there are ways of saving. It's just a matter of keeping your paperwork in order. And the last topic is preparedness. I agree with everyone. You need to update your purchase orders and contract provisions. You need to read them carefully. I have been doing this with my clients for, I don't even know how long. I think the last one that comes to mind is a producer that I have, and we worked on something before the China tariffs came into play. And we added provisions to their contract where these purchase orders were so far out in advance that to protect the client is that they would agree to split any additional taxes. They would negotiate a price, split any taxes, and if there was any rebate, they would be willing to give the portion of the rebate back to the purchaser. And it made everybody happy, and it sort of gave some ease to the client and to the purchaser. You have to look into insurance, set provisions for delays, unforeseen events. A lot of contracts in fashion and international trade generally, they don't put in provisions when the government stops items. It's just considered late, and you can't always control when the government is going to stop your shipment to look at it, and then you're going to be held liable and have to take the discount. So you need to put provisions into your contracts that discuss that. Also, an important point: strengthen your regulatory compliance at this point. You don't want the cloud storm to clear, and then your shipments come in, and those are the ones that are pulled and have an issue. You want to make sure that your items are marked properly, your labels are correct, you've classified the merchandise correctly so that you're paying the correct duties. You have any documentation that you need if it's coming from countries that have a preferential duty scheme, that you have all the documentation in order. Perhaps put together a compliance program if you don't have one, just so that everything is in order when you do it. It's much easier to paint a ship when it's in the dock and it's not moving. Now is the time when the ship is not moving. So you might as well look within and fix everything that you need to fix. Other things are, join a trade program like CTPAT, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. It's a supply chain program. And right now it's sort of on hiatus until June, but it helps in easing, if you're a member, it will ease the number of examinations going forward. So you can sort of set yourself up so that you'll have a smoother ride when everything clears. And that's really what it is. It's just a threefold approach, and trying to hit it at every single level.
Don, that was incredibly helpful. I see another hour happening on just these details alone, which are super important. I also wanted to note that Maria Luigia Franceschelli just sent to us a note that the Italian Ministry of Economic Development today authorized chambers of commerce in each city to issue declarations regarding the state of emergency, which will help with excused performance in that regard. So another note coming to us from Italy. But thank you, that's incredible. As I watch the time, I want to give you all another word to record to us, those of you who are attorneys. I think the word of the day is negotiation. So let's make that our second word, negotiation. And on that note, I would like to turn to Karen, who's engaged in a whole different kind of negotiation with her expertise in employment law. So important for all of those, for all workers right now, and all of those who are managing businesses that have employees. So please, Karen, give us your words of wisdom.
Thank you, Susan. I must say it has been a very busy and challenging time right now. As you already mentioned, and for those on the call, I actually work at Benjamin Moore & Co., which is a paint company. And we have, there are various orders that have come through the pipeline, both in New York, New Jersey, and elsewhere, whereby there's been complete stay-at-home and shutdown orders, except for what has been identified as essential businesses. And Benjamin Moore has been fortunate in that we have, one of the lists includes chemical manufacturing as being an essential business that can remain open. And under that purview, we are actually continuing to do business and remaining open. But you asked me sort of to talk about some of the issues that I have faced as this whole crisis has unfolded, and how I've dealt with them. And I will tell you that it started probably in January, late January for me, where I received notification from our HR folks that there were some people that were actually either in China, stuck in China, or trying to get back home, or had returned home and were talking about returning to work. And obviously, as part of my job, I'm sort of all over the internet. I'm on the CDC's website, whose website I'm visiting every state that we have facilities at. And so the CDC was at that time giving guidance around the 14-day quarantine. So I think in terms of the first issues that I started to deal with, they were travel restrictions issues. We have been very generous as a company in that we had people quarantine when they returned home for 14 days, and we actually paid them during that time. Not every business has the capability to be able to do that, but we had been doing that initially. So that's how we started off with travel restrictions, restricting business travel completely. We actually have trips that our folks take overseas with visiting manufacturing plants there and the like. All of those trips were canceled. Some questions that have arisen for me is, can we restrict personal travel? And the answer to that question is no. But we have asked our employees, as have other companies, to self-report any travel that they have for personal reasons, especially if it's international travel, now questionable with respect to even domestic, given the current state of affairs. But in terms of just letting us know so that we can decide sort of, especially for international travel, whether or not they would need to quarantine. And what we're doing across the board now is just any international travel for personal reasons, you would quarantine. And we were paying that. But some companies are, now that it's become and been declared a pandemic, you know, obviously the hope is that people will make the proper decisions and cancel their trips. And so we have actually declined in that regard now that it's been declared a pandemic to pay for those folks who nevertheless decide to take trips. So that's where I first started dealing with the issue. After that, it became, like I mentioned, the orders. Are you an essential business versus a non-essential business? And obviously, if you are a non-essential business, then you face the issue of having to furlough employees. That creates all sorts of implications that I've been dealing with around the WARN Act. For those who aren't familiar, it's the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act of 1988, where you have to provide employees with notice that there's going to be a mass layoff or a plant closing. Some states like California have created an exemption, so you still have to provide the notice. Sometimes it's 60 days or 90 days, depending on your state. But have relaxed that, obviously, because there's certain exceptions, which include unforeseeable circumstances or natural disasters, but you still nevertheless have to provide notices to employees. So while we've been fortunate in that we haven't had to do anything in the way of plant closings or mass layoffs thus far, obviously I'm getting those notices prepared if it were to come to fruition. In addition, there's issues of you laying off or furloughing people, whether or not they're eligible for unemployment. Those are issues that I'm facing, what the company is willing to do with respect to their paid time off and their ability to use that paid time off before they tap into unemployment. Sick days has also been an issue in terms of, I mean, we have a lot of folks now, everybody's working remotely, right? So your children are home and employees actually need time off to be able to care for their children. In addition to, if they're able to, not everyone can work from home. Or to care for an elderly family member. So I am constantly churning out letters to employees who have said, you know, I need to care for my elderly family member. I don't want to come into the office. How are we going to treat them? We're placing them on a leave of absence, using their available PTO. If they need to stay out or decide to stay out longer than that, then they're actually being able to apply for unemployment. For those of our employees that are still working, obviously, law enforcement may not necessarily be familiar with the orders that are in place and the level of detail. So a lot of companies, including Benjamin Moore, have provided letters to their employees where we actually, that they can provide to law enforcement. I had a situation in New Jersey where some employees were actually stopped by the police and issued citations, so that they actually have something in hand to be able to show I work for a company that is deemed an essential business underneath the order, and I can continue to go to work. And so that's been helpful in making sure we get that out. Other issues, wage and hour considerations for our workers, depending on the order. So before we realized that we were an essential business in New York, as you know, Cuomo initially said 75% of the workforce needed to remain at home, then it dropped to 50%, and then to 25%, and then to 0%, all in a matter of days. And so it was this constant phone calls of how we would restructure the workforce to be able to handle these changes. And so it's a constant moving parts. The fluidity is absolutely necessary, and you have to have a plan and a backup plan and a backup to your backup plan. And that's what we're actually trying to do, and how my days get busy. Some other concerns, health quarantine issues. You know, remember privacy. I keep telling my folks, privacy is still an issue. If someone gets diagnosed with COVID-19, do not share that information with your coworkers. You want to share that they were in proximity to someone who actually was diagnosed, and so that now they need to self-quarantine. But we want to make sure we're protecting employees' privacy rights as well. You know, some people I've heard getting on calls and saying, well, I've heard so-and-so's wife has it, or this, and you know, so we don't want to do that. And we've sort of said there's no need to identify people by name. You can just merely just refer to there's an employee situation and the like. So we're trying to make sure that is an issue. A lot of companies, even I believe it was in Ohio perhaps, where they actually were recommending employers do thermometer temperature checks of employees, screenings. A lot of companies are looking to do that. These are non-contact temperature readings that can be done in the workplace. Something that we are actually considering, but clearly, and the EEOC has issued guidance just recently last week, allowing for that to occur, understanding that, you know, a temperature check and the screenings and questions that are asked can be deemed a medical examination under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we want to be conscious of that. So we're trying to be proactive and putting protocol in place in that regard. But obviously we know there are a lot of people who've been diagnosed with the condition that are asymptomatic. They may not have fevers. And so this is not a foolproof situation in terms of just doing it alone. So we're doing screening as well. I think we're going to start with a pilot program at one of our locations just to see how it works. Other folks I'm hearing are also doing attestations of their employees that are reporting to work. So they're attesting that they have not traveled internationally, that they've not come in contact with anyone who has COVID-19, that their family members haven't, and that they aren't exhibiting any of the symptoms, and obviously don't have a fever. And so that's another avenue that is being pursued. Obviously, as a result of all this, a lot of people are working remotely. And so you need to think about, in terms of various states have requirements around reimbursing employees for expenses associated with working at home, whether it's their paper, their internet usage, and the like. And so those are things that I'm also finding myself having to be mindful of as well. And then preparing for any potential workers' comp issues, were someone to say that they were diagnosed with COVID-19, obviously they need to prove that they actually contracted it at work in order to fall under, you know, be eligible for workers' comp. But those are things that I'm still looking at to make certain we know where we stand should a situation arise. So I'm trying to react to the situations that are happening daily, but also be proactive and start to put plans in place so that we're prepared for anything that actually comes our way. But I'm really sort of, from a positive perspective, you know, obviously I know what 3.3 million people filed for unemployment last week, I'm sorry. And so obviously that's on the concerns of a lot of people with respect to abilities to pay our bills. There are a lot of companies out there that are doing their hardest to make sure they keep their folks employed. That to the extent that they can't, that they are providing them with benefits at the very least so that they have health insurance while they're out. We are actually doing that for our employees. We have had to furlough a few just at small locations. But other than that, what I've heard here is cooperation, communication. In our case, Benjamin Moore does not own our stores. They're independent retailers. And so we've been constant communication with them in terms of finding ways for them to remain open. Most of them would fall under the umbrella of a hardware store. And so they are able to remain open. But obviously folks are at home and they're trying to think of things that they can do, DIY, painting possibly. And so we're trying to find non-contact ways of providing them with paint to be able to move forward in that regard, to keep things flowing. I'd say also, Susan asked me sort of where do I see changes happening going forward as a result of all this? I have 4 points. One, telecommuting. I think a lot of employers are going to start to think about the ability for people to telecommute and work from home as opposed to being in the office. This may indeed change. I mean, we've been constantly assessing how this is working. It's a little bit difficult on some calls when I see the dogs and the kids and everything. But obviously that's because everybody's home. There may, obviously when this is all over and done, working from home may be readily available for others who don't have the necessary, those types of distractions. I think one thing that we're realizing now, obviously a lot of states have legally mandated paid sick leave and a lot don't. There are a few that had things in the pipeline in terms of implementing laws in that regard. New York, as part of their order, actually now included 7 days of paid sick leave. I expect a lot of other states to follow. I do believe, thinking positive, this is going to get better. But I think at the same time, we need to think about time people need off of work to be able to recover, to care for family members and the like, that perhaps sick days may be increased based on this particular situation. I think there may be more increased reliance on technology and less travel. A lot of folks are travel to be able to do their jobs, especially in the fashion industry, buyers and the like. I'm hearing that a lot of folks are actually now looking to buy online that are. And so this may be a wave of the future in terms of less travel and instead being able to review lookbooks and the like via virtual means. And then last, I would say ongoing social distancing, which I'm hearing in the way of sort of how customers interact in stores and the like, but it also impacts employees as well. Jeff, I know you mentioned OSHA, and obviously we've had employees that have expressed concern about reporting to work, as anyone would expect under these circumstances. We are not terminating anyone who does not want to report to work, given the situation. They are being placed on sort of an unpaid leave of absence and following as if they had been furloughed so that they can remain at home. Those that can work remotely are working remotely. So we're doing our best to keep everybody gainfully employed to the extent we possibly can, and to pay those for various circumstances that are clearly outside the realm of their control. And that sort of sums up what's going on in my world.
Karen, you have probably the very busiest corner of the world right now, dealing with employees and workers.
It is a lot.
Yes, and I think we'll want to revisit questions about privacy and so forth going forward. But at this moment, we're running toward the very end of our time. I'd like to turn to Christina, who has, of course, is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and of course, we all just saw that the first Monday in May has been canceled. The Met Ball will not happen. I also want to note that some of you have to leave us. We will put the recording online. In fact, even Gary, I know that you need to leave very shortly. And so I want to take this moment to thank all of our panelists as we turn to Christina, and also to remind you all that we'll hang out in the after party afterwards. So do check your email for the after party. And with that, Christina, please go right ahead.
Great. So thank you, Susan. Susan had asked me to speak about event cancellation and a little bit about our experience with canceling the Met Gala. One thing about this unimaginable situation that we find ourselves in is you start thinking about just the realities of what it is to run a museum. The museum typically gets about 7 million people a year that come through its doors, and the gala itself has hundreds of, not just the people who, the guests at the gala, but the caterers, the photographers, the staff members, and of course the public that loves to come and watch. And the gala itself is the opening night to an exhibition that tends to be hugely successful. We always have thousands of people that come in the door just to see that, in addition to the ones who generally come and support the museum as a whole. So this year was a specific, a very special year for us because April marks the 150th anniversary of the Metropolitan Museum. And so for 5 years, we've been planning a series of celebratory events starting in April that go through the summer. One of them for the Costume Institute, then the theme of this year's exhibition and gala about time, and it was going to be about 150 years of fashion. So supporting that, we would have planned the exhibitions and the receptions and lectures and concerts and the merchandise and licensing that support, that relate to the exhibition. And so looking back to March, when the Met announced its closure, it did so incrementally. So first on March 11th, it announced that events with over 25 people were going to be closed through April 3rd. And then subsequent announcements, we ultimately got down to the fact that the museum would be closed to all staff through July 1st. And then at some time after that, reopened to the public. And that decision comes with a cost of about $100 million. So in the process of canceling those events, we realized that the Met is in a different position with any of those contracts, and that the posture really would have to depend on the fact pattern of the individual situations. In some cases, we have sponsors which are generous and give us money. We have hosts renting out the museum for events, performers, lecturers, caterers, photographers, travel company, the ticket buyers, the public, and the merchandise and the licensing that support the exhibition. And one thing you can't really avoid is, just starting by just looking at the contract, and whether or not you end up relying on it as a business decision is one thing, but you should actually just know what, as a ground rule, what your starting point should be or what your options would be. So look at the contract if there is one. If it addresses force majeure, does it apply? Is it applied to your specific situation? The courts in New York tend to enforce it very, very narrowly. Does it address epidemics and pandemics? If not, in New York, we have different common law doctrines that can help that you might want to think about. Impossibility, impracticability, those generally affect whether or not you are physically able to perform the service that you're obliged to do under the contract. And then there's also frustration of purpose, which is, yes, maybe you could actually physically perform it, but is the purpose of the contract still going to be useful at the if it were enforced? And then you look to any other kind of provision you might have, such as, is there time is of the essence? Would that help? And then you have to remember that in general, all of these kind of things would be supported by a government, a covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and that should always, of course, apply to your business practices anyway. And what's difficult is when you're looking at hundreds of different kind of agreements and relationships, is that each one has very different circumstances. So some of the events were canceled before the government order of the shutdown, and that could affect a legal interpretation of force majeure or impossibility. Some contracts had already been fully performed and others not at all. Some contractors had incurred actual expenses such as travel tickets or food. Others might not. Are any of those expenses refundable? Is it reasonable to request receipts of people who are claiming that they had expenses? Some events might be able to be rescheduled, in which case, well, could you reuse some of those expenses? Is it decor that perhaps can be stored? Is it non-perishable ingredients? And is it practical to be able to store those? And then we have to turn to the other kind of contracts in which the museum would be the beneficiary of the contract. And for example, with our sponsors who are so generous and kind of make it all happen anyway, they often will have an interest in funding a specific type of event or a specific type of exhibition. And in most cases, the reality is that the money's already been spent on the exhibition or the publication or the event by the time something's been canceled or postponed. And then there's been just the impact on the stores that sell the merchandise that's related to the exhibitions. The Met has 3 retail stores inside of its museums, in the main building, at the Met Broyer, and at the Met Cloisters. And we also have 2 off-site retail stores in the Newark Airport and JFK Airport. The off-site stores actually closed at a later time than the main building did. So we have those negotiations with landlords, and what we find is so interesting is how, with each landlord, the first thing we did was reach out to them, because communication, I think, is key in any of these agreements. One never got back to us, still hasn't gotten back to us, and the other one reached out right away and said, make us an offer. Let's start a communication on what's going to work, and we're trying to coordinate among all of our tenants. So you have to just keep in mind the different tone of each relationship that you might have. And then the other branch of the business would be, thankfully that the fulfillment warehouse is exempt from the governor's order for closure, so that we're still able to fulfill internet orders. And it's great to supporting the museum's online presence. We're still pushing out a lot of publications. A lot of what we notice, interestingly, is a really strong interest in the museum's online publication features. We have a program that where we publish free online every out-of-print publication that the Met's ever published. And we've seen in recent weeks a lot of people taking us up on that, which is fun. And it's great that the exemption to the executive order allows us to fulfill orders if someone wants to buy something from the museum during that time off the website. So that's been a helpful little window for us during this really painful time. So the one thing that all of these agreements are still in flux. It's probably going to take a lot of time to negotiate them. But one thing we find is, in most cases, the interest is going to be in, for our special events at least, postponing an agreement, postponing an event. That's not always going to be practical. It could be a very time-sensitive event. So again, all of these things are going to have to be taken one at a time. But again, the common law, like Gary had said, like Don had said, is about relationships, about reaching out right away and just getting that communication open. It helps also to understand what the other party is actually thinking and what their interests are. Oftentimes, you can come up with a solution just by understanding what their actual concern is, other than just the cash. In the case of the landlord, who actually said what they're interested in is consistency, trying to get a plan and just take the temperature of understanding what the whole market is doing. So basically, regardless of the legal obligations that you might have under your contract, ultimately, everything does come down to relationships. These are vendors often that we will deal with year after year after year. The sponsors, as a charity, we rely on the sponsors. We rely on the public and having goodwill with the public. And it really just comes down to just keeping that in mind with the underpinning of knowing what your legal obligations are.
Christina, it sounds like you've been dealing with a microcosm of all of this, and thank you for sharing that information, particularly about New York common law, and reminding us that there are other areas beside to look at outside those contracts as we renegotiate, of course, bearing in mind the relational issues every time. So, we'll look forward to being back at the museum soon, and in another crowded exhibit where we're not afraid to breathe on one another as soon as we can. With all of that in mind, thank you. I know that we have to run. Many of you have to get back to your long commutes to work. That is to stay down the hall to the next office. Or to your kitchen to grab some coffee. But very quickly, each of the panelists, one last word of advice, one last thought before we leave. And again, thank you all for being here. Thanks so much to all of you who sent in great questions. I know there were topics that we couldn't quite get to, but we're going to stay in touch with you all as a community and see what we can do next. This was our first. Thank you for your patience as we worked it all out. And so, running through our panelists, starting back with Tony.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity to be creative and to be socially responsible. So I think that regardless of whatever industry you're in, that this is an incredible opportunity for us to be socially responsible, to help our fellow man, and to do whatever we can to get through this crisis together.
Okay, everybody, buy a T-shirt from Tony so that he can buy more, so that he can send more masks.
There you go. Yeah, that too.
To need it.
That too.
That too. Great. And then to Jeff.
My first lesson is always to remember to unmute. So I have to. That's my big lesson of the day. Everybody here has been amazing. I've learned a lot from listening to all of you across the industry. It's been fantastic. And I think for me, it's coming down to, as important as contracts are, and contracts are very important, the world has changed, and let's not be afraid, in the spirit of what Tony said about creativity, to recognize that we're entering into a new world legally and culturally. So as much as it's important sort of what the law was and what contracts were, we shouldn't be afraid as a community to create something new.
Fabulous. And Diana?
You know, people are longing for connection, and this isolation is going to, I think what you're going to see is that people are going to want to get outside and be in the stores, be in the restaurants. I also do think that there probably will be a baby boom after all of this, which will in turn help the economy. So, I mean, there's a lot of positive things to think about, and you know, my pleasure with everyone, and I so appreciate having this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome to all the babies of 2021. and Karen. Oh, Karen, you're still muted.
Yes, I'm following Jeff. Unmuted. Okay, I guess I would say that as we go through this, keep in mind your employees. Employees are your biggest asset, and obviously, to the extent you can, they should be involved in the decision making. When you're decision making, think about them and how this impacts them. I mean, I'm doing this every day. I look at each individual case in terms of how this is going to impact a person that we need to lay off. What do they need to be able to sustain themselves? People are having, especially our wage and hour workforce, the ability to be able to pay their bills, their day-to-day bills. And so I applaud those companies that have been able to step up and try to supplement and advance those expenses to employees, and are being creative. That's another thing. You need to be creative and have some flexibility in terms of how you can manage to keep them gainfully employed. And I'm seeing a lot of that, and it's refreshing.
Thank you, Karen. It's so important for us to remember absolutely the human factor. Thank you. And Don?
Well, I guess I would just reiterate what I said before, is understand the relationships and work with these people. There will be an end to this. It probably will happen much sooner rather than later. Every good deed that you do is going to be remembered. So do what you can. In the meantime, get all your ducks in order so that when everything clears up, it's smooth sailing and you move forward. And just to, one thing I wanted to raise is that we're all interconnected. There's an A called The Pencil, and it's by Alan Albert. And it just is a pencil, how simple it is. Everything that goes into making that pencil, all the way down the line. And I think it puts everything into perspective as to how we're all interconnected. And that's like a traffic jam. When that first person stops, we all stop. And we need each other. So just keep that in mind when you're negotiating, before you make any moves going forward and make any harsh decisions. And be healthy.
Excellent advice for all of us. Yes, and be well. Be well. And Christina.
Just again, to thank everyone, especially for the tone of optimism, which is so welcome at this point. I think the world's in an unimaginable situation right now, and it just helps to keep that focus towards the future.
Thank you, Christina. And I want to give a shout out to Argentina, to Chile, to South Africa, to all of you, those of you who have joined and sent messages during this time. We will stay in touch. And for my last words, I want to tell you something that actually Jeff Trexler shared with me, or reminded me of last week, and that I've been holding in my mind. The last great global pandemic, of course, was the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919. What followed the Spanish flu was the Roaring 20s. So let's all go forth, be well, and do the same. And hey, see you in the after party right now. Check your reminder email, and we'll be able to talk more one-on-one. Thank you all so very, very much. And again, take good care of yourselves and one another.
Thank you.